And like with the Hadza and the honey thing, yeah, absolutely. I think my ancestors 150,000 years ago, and I'm sure you agree with this, if they found a honey tree, oh, they wore that shit out. 100%. No doubt. They ate all the honey, endured the stings to get the honey. But honey trees, if anybody's ever tried to husband bees, it's they're very finicky, very quirky. Your hive will literally disappear on you overnight. You have no idea what happened, where it went. It's just gone. And that happens in the wild as well. It was a rare occurrence to find a honey tree. And now it seems the Hadza have access to honey trees 24/7, 365. But the way I read the literature, that was a rare occurrence to find a honey tree.
So when I was in Tanzania, I spent a couple of weeks with them and I hunted with them on a number of occasions. And it was nothing to find honey. It was easy.
Right.
And this isn't because they're tending the bees. This is because there are multiple types of bees in Tanzania. There are bees that sting, and there are bees that are stingless, the mariola and other types of bees that are stingless. And so one day we were out hunting. We hiked and sprinted and walked for 10 hours, and we hunted a baboon. And after we successfully hunted a baboon, they found a hive in a tree, and they immediately made a fire and smoked out those bees. And as you said, we wore it out. That entire hive was eaten. And there's pictures on my Instagram from a while ago, or I can put some in the podcast. It's delicious. I mean, it's honeycomb with larvae. And the 3 or 4 Hadza guys that I was with who discovered the hive were the ones that ate the most of the honeycomb with me, and they saved a little bit for the other guys. And then another day I said, hey, let's go find some of this other honey. And it was really nothing for them, Ken. There are these stingless bees, and they make these little tiny flutes, these little straws that go into trees. And so it was me and 3 other Hadza guys, and we just went out on a walkabout, and within 25 minutes, we'd found honey 2 to 3 times in these trees. And they take their axe, and there's video of this on my Instagram from a while ago. I'm sure we can put it in the podcast. And I've chopped, and it's just this little flute that goes into the tree. And then some of these are really big, and they have quite a bit of honey in them.
Sure.
And we're all sharing it around, and it's just a celebration. It's the best honey I've ever had. And then the guy who's probably 60 years old or more said, well, let's go up in the baobab tree. This was in a baobab tree, which they call the tree of life. It has a baobab fruit, which is kind of like dry. It's like a dry type of cotton candy fruit, very citrusy, a lot of vitamin C in the baobab fruit. He literally makes these pegs within probably 5 minutes, hammers them into a tree, and he's 30 feet up in a tree with nothing more than his axe that he used to make these things. And he's around there looking for more hives, and he finds another one. So I think that, and then the other thing I should point out, because I've seen this comment sometimes, is that in tropical areas, bees make honey year round. It's kind of like fruit. There's not a winter where humans evolved for most of our time, and bees are always making honey. It's different in North America, and there is a question of whether, and this is a whole separate discussion, whether humans should eat based on latitude. Is it different for me because I'm living at the equator? It's an interesting hypothesis. Some would argue that I'm getting lots of sunlight here, or my circadian rhythms are different, and that I'm at the equator, so maybe I can eat differently. And then people who are farther from the equator, perhaps they should eat less carbohydrates or less honey on a seasonal basis. I haven't found that to be true for myself when I've lived in Austin, Texas, and other places, but that's another argument. But honey is available year round within probably, I would say, 15 to 20 degrees of the equator in north and south. And the anthropology that I've read suggests that where honey is available, our ancestors ate it. So This is sort of the continuation of the discussion around fruit.
But I think you said something very important, Paul.
Can I just finish?
But I just wanted, let me add this, because this is just to add. You said that they definitely ate the comb and the larva, which I think our ancestors always did that. That just to drain off the honey, I think that never happened. I think they munched on the entirety of it, and that changes the macro composition of it substantially, changes the nutritional value of it substantially. And I think definitely all of our ancestors always ate the comb and the larva. I don't think they just drained off the honey. But I think that was very important that you said that, because that's exactly right. And then that drastically changes the macro ratios, doesn't it?
Uh, a little bit. I mean, so it depends on the comb that you're getting. Like the Mariola bees, the stingless bees, there isn't a lot of comb there. And the other ones, definitely we were eating the larva. So that's going to change the macronutrient composition. I don't know what bug macronutrients are, but I suspect there's a little more protein and fat. I'll have to look it up. I don't have any papers on bee larva macronutrients, but they kind of taste nutty. Yeah. But it's just, I think it's important to understand that there is this swath where we were always eating honey. We know the Hadza are very healthy from a nutritional standpoint, from a longevity standpoint, from a chronic disease standpoint, and a diabetes standpoint. They basically don't have obesity. They don't have diabetes. But some people do believe that they only ate the honey certain times of the year, but that doesn't seem to be what I saw. And the honey is quite available for them. And it's not always in a hive. The Mariola bees don't even have the honey in a hive. It's not the same sort of structure in those stingless bees. So as I was saying, this is just a continuation of the fruit discussion, which I think is really interesting. But the whole discussion of fruit being hybridized or bigger is kind of predicated on like more is worse. Well, I mean, I saw the Hadza eat, hundreds of calories, hundreds of grams of honey, and I ate it with them, on multiple occasions. So I think that you can extend it all the way and say, well, honey's never been different. Honey is just honey, and it's always been the sweetest thing.
Yep.
If you look at the research from Frank Marlowe, the paper is called Tubers as a Fallback Food for the Hadza. Both the men and the women consistently say that honey is their favorite fruit. I mean, that's not surprising, but it's when it is consumed or when it's available, it's consumed without regard to calories or insulin resistance or anything. They're just like, this is amazing. There's also some pretty interesting, at least things I've read. I haven't visited these groups. I think it's the Mbuti pygmies, the MBUTI pygmies, that at certain times of the year, they have a lot of their calories from honey and remain quite insulin sensitive. I think it's over 60 to 70% of their calories come from honey. So there is some historical precedent for this in terms of honey. I know you have mentioned this paper. Maybe we can talk about it just for a moment before we wrap up. This one about...
While you're pulling that up, let me just say that I do think there's an argument to be made for eating seasonally and or geographically. But I think that in order for that argument to be sound, it needs to be seasonally and geographically. Also, you have to consider your own DNA. And my skin pigment and your skin pigment belies the fact that our ancestors have been in the northern latitudes for many, many, many generations. And some of us, many more generations than others. And so at that point, not just because somebody who is, of Nordic descent, they move to the equator, I don't think that geographical eating is probably going to work for that person the same way it would work for the Hadza or another group of people who had been at that latitude for hundreds and hundreds of generations.
So I brought up this honey versus sucrose study. Ken and I didn't have a chance to talk about it at this point in the podcast, but we talked about this one and another one after we stopped recording. So I wanted to add some commentary about our discussion into this part of the podcast because I think it'll be most relevant for what we're talking about here. So the study that I'm thinking of to start is this one. It's one that Ken has talked about in the past. The consumption of honey, sucrose, and high fructose corn syrup produces similar metabolic effects in glucose-tolerant and intolerant individuals. So Ken and I talked about this one after the podcast. But what's interesting about the groups in this study were that if you look at number one, they used Dutch gold honey, which is not raw. I looked up Dutch gold honey. It's not a raw honey, unfortunately. So as Ken and I talk about in this podcast, I don't think all honey is created equally. In the study that I mentioned regarding nitric oxide derivatives from honey, we know that if honey is heated, if honey is light-colored honey, if honey is exposed to air, it's not going to be as beneficial for humans as a raw honey. So they used a honey that was pasteurized, essentially heated, which probably removes some of the beneficial things in honey, might remove the nitric oxide precursors, which has been found in previous studies. So that's the first thing to know about this study, which seemed to equate honey with sugar and high fructose corn syrup. Secondly, if you look at the individuals in this study, they were glucose tolerant, they said, but the average serum insulin was 8.6 and 15.7 in the impaired glucose tolerance group. So the impaired glucose tolerance group definitely has a higher fasting insulin, but as we talked about in this podcast, the average fasting insulin for Americans is 8.6. And we know that most, 90% of Americans have at least one metric suggesting metabolic dysfunction. So I don't think 8.6 is where you want your insulin when you're fasting. So I would say neither of these populations are glucose sensitive at all. It would be very hard to find a population that had a fasting insulin of less than 5. So I get it, but both of these populations are insulin resistant in my opinion. And if you look at the results here in terms of pre and post, you'll see that most of these p-values are not very significant. So the only significant p-values that I could find are this one right here, the serum triglycerides for this specific phase did go up in these people, all of which had some degree of insulin resistance. So you can see this column right here is looking at honey. The pre-triglycerides were 114 plus or minus 17. That's not a healthy level of triglycerides, guys. And the post were 120 plus or minus 18. That's what the whole deal has been made of this thing. So that's what Ken is saying in his videos, that honey is bad for people. I don't understand. So I definitely challenged him with this after our podcast, and he agreed that this maybe is not the best study regarding honey, but he and I will probably do a whole separate podcast with these two studies. But this is one of the studies that Ken had advanced, and I love that he and I could have such a friendly, cool, cordial debate in this podcast. But this is one of the studies that Ken had advanced, saying that honey was not good or that honey was the same as sugar. And I just wanted to share why that's probably not the case when you actually drill down into the study. Second study is another one that Ken has shared in the past, looking at fruit consumption and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So what's important to know about this one is that though the title and the conclusions say that fruit of 4 servings a day versus 2 servings a day worsens steatosis, dyslipidemia, and glycemic control in NAFLD patients, when I actually look at this, and I showed Ken this after the podcast, and he agreed, the category of fruits was based on colored fruits, dried fruits, and other fruits. Well, first of all, we know that a lot of dried fruits have added sugar. Secondly, other fruits. What is other fruits? Does that include canned peaches? Does that include maraschino cherries with added sugars? So this is the problem with most nutritional research, is that this study compared people with 4 or more servings of fruit per day and 2 or less servings of fruit per day. And the fruit that they were using is not real fruit. This is the problem with nutritional studies today, is that researchers don't really understand how to design a study. What is a dried fruit doing in this with potentially added sugar? And what are other fruits? We just don't know, which to me makes the results of this study very suspect. And there are other studies that show that in patients with NAFLD, you can eliminate processed fructose and include fruit fructose, and the NAFLD gets better. So those are both really important studies that I wanted to add. At this point in the podcast, we'll go back to the discussion with Ken, but we just didn't have enough time to get to these. Ken had to go work on his farm, but I really wanted to show those 2 studies in the podcast because Ken had advanced them in the past. We talked about them after the podcast, and I wanted to put them in here.